Imagine uncovering a chilling family secret so devastating that it drives a devoted preacher to the brink of the unthinkable. A betrayal so profound it doesn't just wound, it obliterates everything he once held sacred. In a single moment, years of trust, love, and faith crumble into dust, leaving only the raw agony of deception. This is the story of a man who lived for his beliefs and cherished his family, until a merciless truth tore through his soul and left him standing at the edge of darkness. Welcome to Crime Wave Stories HQ. I want to thank all my viewers, especially my subscribers, for your continued support as we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Pastor Moses John, 42, was the heart of his Florida community. His passionate sermons about faith, family, and morality attracted hundreds of followers who saw him as a guiding light. His deep commitment to his church and his family made him admired by many, a living example of the values he preached. His wife, Jessie John, 38, was his perfect partner. Graceful and poised, she balanced her role as a preacher's wife with being a loving mother to their 5 children, Mercy, 16, Moses Jr., 14, Henry, 12, Sonia, 9, and Mikkel, 6. Jessie was deeply involved in the community, leading Sunday school, organizing charity events, and supporting Moses's ministry. Together, they seemed like the perfect family, blessed by faith and admired by all. At the center of their spiritual life was Deacon Henry John, Moses' 65-year-old father. Henry had been a respected church elder for decades, serving as a moral compass for the congregation. He had a powerful influence on Moses's upbringing, instilling in him a deep respect for God, a strong commitment to family, and strict adherence to Scripture. Moses often praised Henry in his sermons, calling him the rock that held their family together. The King household was always full of life. Mercy was bright and dedicated to her studies, often volunteering with church youth programs. Moses Jr. was quiet but dependable, always helping during services. Henry was the curious and playful one, while Sonia was sensitive and eager to please. The youngest, Mikkel, was the baby of the family, adored by everyone and blissfully unaware of life's complexities. Sunday dinners at Henry's house were a cherished family tradition. They always started with scripture readings and heartfelt prayers led by Henry. Afterward, the family would engage in lively discussions about the church and community. To Moses, these gatherings symbolized the strong bond within the King family, a reflection of their shared faith and devotion. One evening, as the family sat around their oak dining table, enjoying a rare moment of laughter, Mercy excitedly shared an idea. For my genealogy project at school, I thought it'd be fun if we all did a DNA test. We can learn about our ancestry and maybe even find distant relatives. Her younger siblings cheered at the idea, making wild guesses about royal bloodlines or mysterious origins. Moses, always supportive of his children's interests, smiled warmly. That sounds like a great idea. It'll be something fun for all of us to do together. Across the table, Jessie's smile faded. She reached for her glass of water, her fingers trembling slightly. I don't know, Abby, she said softly. These things aren't always accurate, and they can be a little invasive. Her voice trailed off as she glanced at Henry, who sat silently at the head of the table, his usual stern expression unchanged. Oh, come on, Jessie, Moses said, waving off her hesitation. It's just a simple family activity. We have nothing to hide. He reached across the table and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Jessie hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, she said in a near whisper. The children cheered as Moses pulled out his phone to order the DNA kits. Henry gave a tight smile but remained silent, sipping his coffee. A few weeks later, the results arrived. Mercy eagerly gathered everyone around the computer as Moses logged into the website. The room buzzed with excitement as they explored their ancestral history, learning about historical connections and distant relatives. But as Moses continued reading, his expression darkened. Wait, he muttered, leaning closer to the screen. This says I'm not a DNA match with any of my kids. He chuckled nervously. That has to be a mistake, probably a mix-up in the database. Jessie froze, her grip on the chair tightening. Henry's face remained calm, but his jaw visibly clenched. "I'll call the company," Moses said firmly. "They probably just made an error." He kissed Jessie's head and reassured her. "Don't worry, I'll fix it." Over the next few days, Moses contacted the genealogy company, confident they had made a mistake. He explained the issue, expecting a correction. But when their response came, his world shattered. "We've triple-checked the results," the company representative said over the phone. "There's no mistake. The children's biological father isn't you. And based on the samples submitted, the DNA markers match another close relative." Moses's stomach dropped. He asked them to check again, but the answer remained the same. Hanging up the phone, he sat motionless, his mind racing. There was only one possible match, his father, Henry. A wave of realization crashed over him. His mind reeled back to moments he had overlooked, Henry's frequent visits, Jessie's unease around him, her hesitation to take the DNA test. It all made horrifying sense now. His hands shook as he grabbed the printed DNA results, reading them over and over, as if willing them to change. His heart pounded in his chest, rage bubbling inside him. His entire life, his faith, his family, it had all been a lie. That evening, Moses stormed into the living room, gripping the papers so tightly they crumpled in his hands. Jessie sat folding laundry, unaware of the fury building inside him. Without a word, he hurled the papers onto the table. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice shaking with anger and betrayal. His eyes burned with rage as he took a step closer, his body trembling with the weight of the revelation. Jessie's hands froze mid-fold. Slowly, she turned to the crumpled papers, her face instantly draining of color. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. A heavy silence filled the room, thick with tension. Moses's chest heaved as he waited, his patience wearing thin. "Say something," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. Jessie felt her chest tighten as she stared at Moses, confusion and fear flickering in her wide eyes. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. Moses's jaw clenched, his face dark with anger. "The DNA results, Jessie," he snapped. "They're saying I'm not the father of my children. But here's the part that doesn't make sense, it also says there's another match in our family. Care to explain that?" Jessie felt the strength drain from her legs. She reached for the back of the chair, gripping it to steady herself. A chill spread through her body as her mind raced for an explanation, an excuse, anything. There must be a mistake," she stammered. "That can't be right." Moses took a step closer, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me, Jessie." His eyes were sharp, piercing through her like daggers. "I went back to the lab. I had them verify it. There is no mistake." He threw the crumpled DNA test results onto the table. "So, I'll ask you again. Explain this." Jessie's lips quivered. Tears welled in her eyes, but she still said nothing. Moses let out a bitter laugh. "Nothing to say? After all these years?" He shook his head, stepping back as if he couldn't bear to be near her. Jessie finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Moses, But he cut her off, his voice cold and sharp. "Don't. Just tell me the truth." The room remained silent, the weight of betrayal hanging thick in the air. Jessie lowered her head, and in that moment, Moses knew the truth was even worse than he had imagined. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the chair, her body shaking. She tried to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. Then, like a dam bursting, sobs racked her body. "It's true," she choked out between gasping breaths. "I never wanted you to find out, but I can't lie anymore." Moses's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded as dread settled in his stomach. "Find out what, Jessie?" Jessie gripped the hem of her dress so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't look at him. The shame was unbearable. "It was Henry," she finally whispered. Moses blinked. His body tensed. What? Jessie sucked in a shaky breath. Henry, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. It was your father. Moses felt like the ground had vanished beneath his feet. His father? What was she saying? His stomach twisted. Jessie's voice broke as she continued. Early in our marriage, he forced himself on me. She clutched her arms, as if trying to hold herself together. I was too afraid to fight back. He had power over me, Moses. He knew exactly how to manipulate me, how to make me feel trapped. Moses shook his head, unable to process what he was hearing. No. Jessie's sobs deepened. I didn't know how to stop it. He kept coming back. And then I got pregnant. Again. And again. She looked up at Moses, desperation in her tear-filled eyes. All 5 of them, Moses. Her voice cracked, breaking into a whisper. They're all his. Moses staggered back, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. His world tilted, threatening to crush him under the weight of her words. His father? His children? No. This had to be some kind of nightmare. The woman he had loved, cherished, and trusted above all else had been living with this horror for years. And the man he had respected, his own father, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. A deep, guttural sound rose from his chest, part agony, part rage. Without another word, Moses turned and stormed out of the house. That night, he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his hands ached. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling in rapid bursts. His entire life, his family, his faith, his ministry, had been a lie. His children, his pride and joy, weren't even his. His wife had been trapped in a living nightmare. And his father? His father was a monster. Shock. Pain. Disbelief. Then came the anger. A fire ignited inside him, white-hot and all-consuming. He slammed his fists against the dashboard, his entire body shaking with rage. Why? He roared into the empty car. How could they do this to me? Tears streamed down his face as violent sobs tore through his chest. The memories flooded back, family dinners, Sunday church services, his father preaching about honesty and faith. All of it. Lies. As the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, Moses found himself at the edge of a lake, staring at the still water. The pain inside him hardened into something colder, sharper. Forgiveness? No. They had to pay. The thought brought a disturbing sense of calm. His mind sharpened, focused. He knew exactly what he had to do. When he returned home, Jessie was sitting in the living room, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked up, her lips parting as if to say something. Moses stepped forward, silent, his grip tightening around the kitchen knife he had hidden behind his back. Jessie's voice trembled. Moses. I know you're hurt. But we can. Don't. His voice was low, devoid of emotion. Don't you dare try to fix this with words. Jessie stood, wringing her hands. I was trapped, Moses. I didn't know how to stop him. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I never wanted to hurt you. Moses let out a bitter laugh. You didn't want to hurt me? His voice rose. You let him violate our marriage. You let him sit at my table. You let me raise his children, thinking they were mine. Jessie dropped to her knees, sobbing. Please, Moses. I love you. We can fix this. Fix this? His voice erupted in rage. This can't be fixed. Before she could say another word, he plunged the knife into her chest. Jessie gasped, her hands flying to the wound. Shock and agony filled her eyes. Moses yanked the blade out and struck again, this time in her abdomen. Blood spilled onto the carpet. Jessie tried to crawl away, weakly reaching out for something, anything, but Moses's fury consumed him. You should have told me the truth. He drove the blade in again. You should have stopped him. By the time she lay still, her body lifeless, Moses stepped back, panting. His pulse thundered in his ears. But the rage didn't fade. There was still one more person who needed to face justice. The night air was thick as Moses drove to Henry's house. His hands were steady on the wheel, his mind cold and focused. Jesse's lifeless body was still fresh in his mind. Burdened with nothing left to lose, Moses stepped through the front door. Henry sat at the dining table, sipping tea, his Bible open in front of him. When he saw Moses, his eyes flickered with surprise, and a trace of fear. "Moses?" Henry set his cup down. "What are you doing here?" Moses didn't answer. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled DNA results, and threw them onto the table. "Explain this." Henry's eyes darted to the paper, then back to Moses. I don't know what this is," he said, his voice uncertain. Moses's hands trembled. His voice was laced with fury. "Don't you dare lie to me. You violated Jesse. You fathered my children." Henry stood, raising his hands. "Moses, listen to me. It's not what you think." Moses took a step forward. "Don't lie." Moses's voice exploded in the room, shaking the very walls with his rage. His face twisted in fury as he glared at the man before him. "You destroyed my family," he spat, his breath heavy with years of suppressed hatred. "You're a monster." Henry barely had time to part his lips before Moses lunged forward, his grip on the knife ironclad. The blade plunged deep into his father's side. Sharp, guttural cry tore from Henry's throat as he staggered backward, his hand instinctively clutching at the wound. His shirt darkened with blood, spreading out like a blooming flower as he gasped for breath. But Moses was far from finished. The years of agony, the betrayal, the deception, it all surged through him, burning hotter than fire. His arm moved with purpose, with the force of every painful memory carved into his soul. The knife sank into Henry's flesh again. And again. And again. Each thrust of the blade was precise, methodical, fueled by an anger that had rotted inside him for too long. Henry's knees buckled, his body crumbling to the floor. He writhed, hands weakly grasping at the air as if he could push away the pain. Blood pooled beneath him, the rich metallic scent thick in the air. His breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. His body, once strong and imposing, was now nothing more than a frail, crumbling mass of flesh and regret. Moses loomed over him, his chest rising and falling in heavy bursts. His eyes, once filled with grief, now burned with cold, unshakable resolve. "You deserve this," he muttered, his voice steady, almost eerie in its calmness. "You deserve to feel the pain you put me through." Henry's body twitched, his muscles convulsing as he tried, uselessly, to drag himself away. But there was no escape. His fingers barely scraped the floor before his strength failed him. Moses knelt beside him, his breath slow, controlled. He leaned in, his lips curling in something that wasn't quite a smile. His voice was soft, almost tender, but dripping with venom. "This is for Jesse," he whispered. The blade gleamed under the dim light as he repositioned his grip. "This is for the years of lies." The knife traced its path down Henry's quivering body. "This is for my children." Without hesitation, without an ounce of mercy, Moses brought the blade down and began the gruesome act. Henry's body bucked, his mouth opening in a silent scream before the sound finally tore free, a sound so raw, so primal, it barely seemed human. His muscles spasmed, his fingers curling into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. The pain was unbearable, worse than any suffering he had ever inflicted on others. His vision blurred, his cries turning hoarse as his body betrayed him. The blood gushed freely, spilling onto the floor in a dark, endless river. Moses remained unmoving, his expression unreadable, his hands steady as he finished his work. The knife slipped from his fingers, landing with a wet thud against the blood-soaked floorboards. Henry's body convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back, his mouth parting one last time. A rattling breath shuddered from his lungs before silence swallowed the room whole. Moses stepped back, his chest rising and falling with deep, heavy breaths. The room smelled of iron and death, the air thick with the echoes of Henry's suffering. But there was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction in his face. Only an emptiness that stretched endlessly inside him. His hands were slick with blood, his clothes soaked in it. He turned without a word and walked out of the house. The night air was cool, but the weight of what he had done pressed down on him, heavier than before. He lowered himself onto the porch steps, staring out into the quiet street, his Bible resting in his lap. Then came the sirens. The distant wails grew louder, closer, until the flashing red and blue lights bathed the street in color. Neighbors stood outside their homes, their faces pale with fear. The officers stepped out of their cars cautiously, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. They had been expecting a maniac, a rabid beast ready to attack. But instead, they found Moses sitting calmly, bathed in the glow of the street lamp. His expression was unreadable, his face blank. "It's done," he said simply, his voice disturbingly steady. He lifted his hands, surrendering himself without a fight. "God's justice has been served." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their fingers tightening around their weapons. They approached slowly, their footsteps crunching against the gravel, half expecting him to strike. But Moses didn't move. They cuffed him swiftly, securing his wrists with cold steel. One officer, swallowing down his nerves, cautiously stepped inside the house. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. The room was a slaughterhouse. Blood stained every inch of the floor, the furniture, the walls. Henry's body lay in a grotesque state, his chest riddled with stab wounds, his manhood cruelly severed. The officer staggered back, bile rising in his throat. Outside, Moses was being placed into the patrol car when he turned to one of the officers. His voice was eerily calm, almost conversational. "Jesse," he said. "She's at our house. She betrayed me too." The officers froze. The air grew thick with dread. Within minutes, a separate team of officers arrived at Moses's home. They forced the door open, stepping cautiously inside. But there was no saving Jessie. Her body was barely recognizable. Torn apart. Disassembled. A brutal display of anger and pain, arranged like a twisted masterpiece of suffering. The officers stood frozen, their stomachs churning. Back at the station, Moses sat across from the investigators, his expression blank. He told them everything. Every detail. Every cut. Every scream. His voice carried no remorse, no hesitation. "She lied to me for years," he said of Jesse. "And my father, he ruined everything I believed in." He lifted his eyes to meet theirs. They had to pay. The officers, hardened by years of violence, felt something they had not felt in a long time. Fear. Moses's trial became a national spectacle. A preacher turned murderer. A man of faith, now a monster of vengeance. His defense argued that betrayal had driven him mad. That he had been pushed past the limits of human endurance. Psychologists described his suffering, the pain of discovering the truth about his children, the years of lies from Jesse, the horror of his father's crimes. But the prosecution didn't waver. They showed the photos. They described the mutilation. They painted a picture of a man who had let his rage consume him entirely. The jury deliberated for days. When they returned, their verdict was clear. Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, bound by the law, delivered his sentence, life in prison. No chance of freedom. Moses's children, now orphaned, were sent to different homes. They would grow up burdened by the horror of their family's past, their name forever stained by blood. As Moses left the courtroom, shackles clinking with each step, he clutched his Bible tightly. His lips moved in whispered prayers, his faith unshaken despite everything. To the world, he was no longer a man of God. He was a cautionary tale. A warning of what secrets and betrayal can do to even the most faithful. And so, the preacher who once spoke of salvation now carried only the weight of his own destruction. If you like stories like this, you are in the right place. Just stay tuned. In our next episode, we'll explore another gripping tale of hidden truths, cruelty, and survival. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. Have you experienced something that changed you forever? Share your story in the comments. Your words could be the hope someone else needs.